Hey, this is Jay Underwood. I play Johnny Storm, the Human Torch in the original Fantastic Four production, here to talk about Doomed, and you are listening to Without Your Head.
Welcome to the station of decapitation without your head. I'm Nasty Neil, and I'm joined by comic book writer and the man behind Powfolio, David Campiti.
Greetings.
Excellent. It's good to have you here.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. And so I have Powfolio on my app on my phone, and I could explain what it is, but I'm sure you do a much better job.
Oh, sure. Let's back into it this way. I'm assuming a number of your listeners are comic book fans, or at least want to be. But I've discovered over these past few years, as comic shops have vanished or dwindled down. Some of you may remember that back in the 90s, there were more than 8,000 comic book stores across the U.S. Since the shrinkage of the market, there's maybe 1,800 stores. So that means kids aren't collecting comics. Many of them have never held a comic book in their hands. I have an 11-year-old daughter in school, and except for a couple of her friends that have been to my house, not a single other one of them has ever seen a real comic book, which is kind of startling and depressing at the same time.
Yeah.
But there aren't the mom and pop shops, newsstands, and drugstores and stuff that carry comics like when I was a kid, where I could walk up the street and go into a place that had just about every comic I could possibly want. Not just Marvel and DC, but at the time Archie and Dell and Harvey and Warren and the Classics Illustrated and all that stuff. You don't find that anymore. So I needed to find a way to get people reading comics again without having to travel 60 miles to a comic book store, because kids certainly aren't going to pop on a bicycle and pedal 60 miles to get to one. So we came up with the idea of Powfolio, which is a free streaming comics app. So you can download it for your iPhone, Mac iOS, or for Android. So we cover just about everybody. Once you download the free app, if you're familiar at all with Netflix, then there's no learning curve with this. It comes up, it looks very much like a screen you'd see on Netflix with new product scrolling across the top, and then it breaks down issues you're reading, latest content, trending titles, and all these sections: horror, manga, superhero, action, comedy, fantasy, science fiction, leading ladies. There's even a section of mature stuff: mythology, graphic novels, vampires, military, and the list goes on and on and on. And what's more, we have sections for Golden Age stuff from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and even a section devoted to kids' comics. Imagine tens of thousands of comic books, all free, right on your phone or other device.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned comic book shops, and my brother's a huge comic book fan, and he's got Doctor Strange tattoo and other things. And throughout the 80s and the early 90s, I remember he would go to every month he'd get a folder, like they would save, the issues he wanted, and he'd get a great big folder of comics, and he would bring home and read, and that was and that also took up a lot of room, as you mentioned, having a comic book collection. And with the app, it's not the same as maybe holding the actual issue. You can read the comics without taking up a bunch of room in your house.
Yeah, well, there's a number of cool things there. One thing that we're doing is the app is streaming. So, in other words, it doesn't clog up your device with all these downloads, even. So, we've developed with a company called Glowdot, a wonderful fellow named Rick Strom, created the magic behind the app, where he figured out a way to quickly, even using data instead of Wi-Fi, quickly downloading high-res images that will look great even on the large screen of an iPad Pro. Now, if you've ever used an iPad Pro, it's larger than a printed comic book. So it still looks great on that, and you can pull up every panel larger or whatever you want to do for easy reading, and it just looks gorgeous. So imagine all these tens of thousands of comics from the golden age up to the present day, all free, that you can watch whenever you want on your screen, and you're not even tying up any hard drive memory on your device.
Yeah. So what are some of the benefits for the comic book, the writers and the people who own the specific comics that are on Powfolio for being on there?
Oh, sure. Well, just like anything, it's a money-making venture. Mm-hmm. So think of it this way. The concept of free content ad-supported has been around for about 100 years. I mean, we're doing radio right now. Mm-hmm. Now, most radio is free content, and you sit through the ads. Television, free content, you sit through the ads. There are so many newspapers these days, stuff you get in the mail, or magazines and so forth, that are all free content ad-supported. So we've done exactly the same thing with Powfolio. So as somebody is reading a comic book, whether it's, let's say, the original Captain Marvel or my own comic Exposure or Bonsai Girl or whatever they're trying to read, every fourth or fifth page, an ad will pop up. Okay, and you read the ad, and then you're off to the next page. The people, the publishers that sign up to be part of Powfolio make their money from the advertising, just like anybody that works with television or radio does. So the money comes from there.
Yeah. So do you seek out people to be on there, or do people send in submissions, or a little bit of both?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. So far, we've dealt with, bona fide publishers that trying to get as wide a range of things as possible. So not only do you have, classic stuff like the original Captain Marvel and Green Hornet and Plastic Man and Mary Marvel and all that stuff, but we've got stuff from, Antarctic Press, Arcana, Atomica, Blatant Comics, Caliber Press, Graphic India, Heroic Publishing, Nevo Digital, Kingstone, Red Giant Entertainment, Rothic, Titan Comics, Shadowline, so many others. So dozens of publishers and tens of thousands of comics for a real wide range there.
Mm-hmm. Now, you can't deny, the last 4 or 5 years, maybe a little longer, how popular comic book movies are and TV shows based off comics. Has that resulted in people who might not have read comics before seeking out those comics and other comics?
Well, here's the problem. The comic business has shrunk rather than expanded. You would think that there would be an expansion because comics as comic subjects, as films, as games, as merchandise have become literally multi-billion-dollar earning businesses, but that hasn't really affected the comics. Comics from Marvel and DC don't make money. They produce the comics as the loss leaders to bring people into the movies and TV shows and all the other stuff, because it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The market has shrunk so much that people don't go out and try to find the comics. It's not like you can go to your local corner drugstore and they've got 3 comic racks full of cool stuff. That just doesn't happen. As I said earlier, there's a whole generation of kids that have never had a comic book in their hands. So it's not something they go out after because to them it doesn't exist. If it's not something that's in your face all the time, you don't even know that it's there. Mm-hmm. And that's why something like Powfolio became necessary.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned all the different genres, and some stuff's for adults, and you have the kids section, and then you have the Golden Age comics. So what kind of age range downloads Powfolio?
So far, we've gotten kids, 8, 9, 10 years old, reading stuff, and then we have, retirees who are looking at some of the Golden Age stuff from their youth. So it's nice to see that broader range. And one thing that's been nice about bringing people together on the app, if you said you'd played with it on your iPhone, you may notice up in the upper right corner of the Powfolio app is a little white word balloon. If you click on the word balloon, suddenly you are in a place called the Powfolio Global Chat. So anybody that's using Powfolio anywhere on the planet, you can correspond with, give people links to cool things, talk about what comics you like, whatever you want to do. Like I'm looking on there right now, and there's a couple of dozen people up here talking about things. Earlier there were people asking about Halloween reading, and did we have anything cool up here that might deal with political subjects? Obviously, that's high on everybody's mind right now. And the answer is yes. We even have a comic up there called First Daughter, sort of a superhero female president, daughter of the President of the United States. So all sorts of cool stuff you can talk about on here. Yeah. What's more, let's say you pick a comic book on here that you think's cool, like, here's one, Last Blood. I can click on Last Blood, and then another one of those little word balloons pops up. I click on that, and I can start my own chat room with anybody else that I like that can be part of that chat. So you can quite literally have 10,000 different chat rooms on Powfolio going at any given time. So it's quite a way to bind people together that have an interest in the comics.
Yeah, you build your own community there. It's very cool.
Exactly right.
Yeah, there's also President Evil I see on here.
There you go.
Which is a great comic book.
And it's very cool because you make sure that your push notifications are activated, and you'll find every day new content is being uploaded. So you can follow everything that's new, and there's so much up there already that you could make reading comics your full-time job on here and pretty much never run out, since new stuff is coming up every day.
Yeah, I was just looking at the Golden Age when we get G.I. Joe, John Wayne, and for horror fans out there like myself, there's we got Eerie Comics and Haunted Thrills and a lot beyond.
Oh yeah, I'm looking right now at Weird Terror and so forth, and it's so cool to get the stuff that you've only read about, perhaps in articles dealing with the Golden Age, but have never had access to this stuff, because much of the Golden Age stuff that's on here has never been reprinted anywhere. So either you go out and you spend thousands to collect the Golden Age comics, or you pop on here and read it for free.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people have heard of Tales from the Crypt, that kind of stuff, but a lot of these look very similar to that style. Or from that era. It's very, I've never actually read a lot of these, so I'm looking forward to checking
them out. It's very neat. And as you go through, you'll find a lot of those are done by some of the same people. So it really is pretty neat.
Yeah. So when did you yourself get into comic books?
Oh, I was a little kid, probably back in 1967. So I was right in the heart of that Stan Lee, Jack Kirby era. So I grew up on Marvel Comics, and of course I also followed DC and Dennis the Menace comics from Fawcett, and I bought Classics Illustrated and a few Harvey and some Gold Key. So I collected a lot, not everything from everybody, but there were dozens of comics that I bought every month. And as I got older, got into the creepy, eerie, and Vampirella comics from Warren and Marvel's monster magazines of the 70s and so forth. So I was very much into that era. plus Marvel at the time had reprints of their earliest stuff, and so I read all that stuff. And then as I got further into my college years and so forth, I realized I want to write comics for a living. So soon after I got out of college, I was working in radio of all things, and started submitting to comic book publishers. And I eventually moved on to do advertising work and so forth. But I was writing Superman stories for DC Comics and working for Pacific Comics and a whole bunch of other publishers. Eventually became a comic publisher myself.
Mm-hmm. Now, what caused you to become a publisher yourself? Like, what was the motivation there?
Well, as with anything, you find when you're writing comics, well, there's only so much you can do. You might not be able to get enough work from DC or Marvel or wherever you feel like working. Okay, what are your other options out there? Well, in my case, I had worked in advertising, got used to working with artists and with printers and so forth, and so I started packaging books for other publishers. And then in the mid to late 80s, it was like, well, I could do this as a publisher myself. So I wrote a business plan and started a company called Innovation Publishing. And we worked with Stephen King and Anne Rice and a bunch of other best-selling authors to do adaptations of their novels.
Oh,
Plus,
cool.
I licensed a whole big load of comics, rights to Lost in Space, Quantum Leap, Dark Shadows, Beauty and the Beast, Forbidden Planet, and a whole bunch of other things. And so we were doing probably 10 books a month that were pretty darn popular. We were selling 60,000 copies in the direct sales market, which is pretty nice circulation at the time. There are publishers these days that would kill for 60,000 copies.
Yeah. Was the comic book business, was that something hard to get into? Because, like, I wouldn't even know where to start. Like, how to get involved in writing a comic book?
Well, as with anything else, you do your market research. So I had been a reader not only of comics since the 60s, but I read all the publications about comics. They were publishing at the time Rocket's Blast Comic Collector and Comics Journal and Comic Reader and The Buyer's Guide and so forth. And I was reading all that. So I made it a point to start going to the conventions, and I met with editors and learned what they needed and learned what not to do and so forth. So I started submitting stories and eventually broke in as a writer. And then I found I could sell more work to publishers if I could match up with a terrific artist and maybe a letterer and a colorist. You couldn't sell more to Marvel and DC that way, but the smaller publishers, Pacific Comics and Eclipse and all that, they were more into buying a complete package. So then I gravitated to putting entire books together for a variety of publishers. Probably did a few hundred books over a period of time, and then decided to get the financing and go into publishing myself. Mm-hmm. And I did that for about 5 years, from 88 to 93. Then in 93, I stepped away from that to start the company that I am most known for, Glass House Graphics, which is an animation studio and art agency where we represent something like 190 artists from all around the world. So dozens of comic books that people read every month, from DC, Marvel, IDW, Dark Horse, Dynamite, and a bunch of the others. The artwork, lettering, and coloring come through my company.
No, that's very cool.
So I know just about everybody that way.
Yeah. No, when I had Nicholas Vince on the show, who actually people know as Chatterer Cenobite from the Hellraiser films, for a few years he actually wrote comics for Marvel, and he talked about the bullpen, and I don't know if that would have been the same time anytime you worked for Marvel, but it was like, he said it was, I guess it was kind of brutal. He said it would just be a bunch of people in a room throwing out ideas, and, they would take them or not. Do you know anything about that?
Not really. The bullpen that I'm familiar with is much different from what he's described. Mm-hmm. If you remember reading any of those classic Marvels from the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, John Romita, Steve Ditko, in that era, Stan was famous for talking about the mighty Marvel bullpen, where everybody was doing all this great stuff, and he made it sound like everybody was there in the Marvel offices just having a grand old time turning out this stuff. The Marvel bullpen of the 60s did not exist. It was a fantasy. There was a Marvel bullpen for a time in the 40s and in the 50s, and he was recalling that memory. But all the artists that we learned about, Jack Kirby and Ditko and so forth, all worked from home and popped in the office maybe once a week to drop off their artwork. Mm-hmm. Stan wasn't even in the office 5 days a week. He was only in there 2 to 3 days a week, and he wrote the scripts at home. Mm-hmm. So that didn't exist. As it got further into the 70s, and then beyond that, they did form a bullpen as they had 40, 60, 80, eventually 100 comics a month coming out. And that was a straightforward production department. There was even a section where people were trained by Johnny Romita, and they got nicknamed Romita's Raiders as they worked in there. But a bullpen where people actually worked latter-day stuff in the past couple of decades really hasn't existed as such, because you have editors in charge of their own domains of working on their half-dozen titles, or for a while they had senior editors and then editors under them, and they were in charge of large blocks of books. But even that wasn't a standard bullpen. So what it sounds like your fellow there was describing was quite different from what we've worked with when we've been producing work for Marvel.
Yeah, I understand there. So, Powfolio, how can you get Powfolio?
Powfolio is very simple because it's free. So if you have your iPhone or your Android device or whatever it might be, just go into whatever store that you get your other apps. Mm-hmm. I use all Apple products, so I download off the App Store. Mm-hmm. And just look for Powfolio. It'll pop right up. It's a quick download. Tap on it. It'll open. It'll look like a Netflix type of interface. Very simple to use. So what's better than free?
Exactly. Yeah, I have Samsung Galaxy here. It hasn't exploded yet, but
my wife used a Samsung for a couple of years, and then I brought her over to the other side. She has an iPhone 7 now.
I also have a tablet, which I think will be really nice to read a lot of these. And I'm not just saying this because you're on here, but I'm really interested in reading a lot of these the golden horror comics, and maybe we can get some people listening to the show to read them too, and we can talk about them on the show every week.
And that would be very, very cool. And they will find there's not only straightforward horror comics from the golden age, but current stuff on there. I even write one on there that's called Exposure, which is basically the X-Files type of thing done with a couple of sexy babes. So I did that in the 90s, and it got popular enough again thanks to things like Powfolio and us putting them up as a web comic that I came back and did news stories recently, and those are pretty much dealing with different types of horror subjects. So your readership should check out that one.
Yeah, sir, awesome. Now I have to ask you, it's not Powfolio related, but what are some of your favorite comic book adaptations on film?
Comic book adaptations on film. Well, I tell you, I actually really enjoy all the Marvel movies.
The Marvel Universe one specifically.
Yep. I think they do a fine job of that. I was making a joke at the beginning. The House of Idea was more like the House of Idea because it seemed to be the same story. The hero fights a bigger, meaner, nastier version of himself. we saw that in Iron Man and the Hulk and a few others. But it's pretty well settled out. Guardians of the Galaxy was phenomenal. Mm-hmm. I really enjoyed the new Doctor Strange movie that just came out.
I just saw it yesterday.
Yeah. So those are a lot of fun. Over the years, I enjoyed the first Hellraiser movie and not Hellraiser, Hellboy movie, mm-hmm. and things like that. But the Marvel movies, I think, have been doing very well. The opposite of what DC's been doing there.
I would agree. I would agree a lot with that, especially stuff like Batman versus Superman. And
I saw that, and the whole Martha thing was so poorly handled, mm-hmm. and it was one of these things. Okay, if you're trying to do a more grown-up movie, why don't you have the adults have a conversation before throwing a bus at one another?
Yeah. So when we went to see Avengers, like I said, my brother's a huge comic book fan since he was a little kid, and he was so excited when Thanos made the appearance at the end of the because he actually has a big Thanos tattoo on his arm. He's like, "Oh my God, Thanos!" So,
that is very cool.
What about with the popularity of The Walking Dead? Has that inspired like a more horror comics?
Oh, I've seen some. I've not seen a whole lot. Mm-hmm. More horror comics, and I think that's because what we were talking earlier. Marvel and DC releasing comics can afford to do it as kind of a loss leader, where they know that they're doing comics these days. You'll notice most comics are done in a much more realistic style. You don't see stuff that looks like John Buscema or Jack Kirby these days. Everything looks like it's photo-referenced. Well, that's because it's so much easier for the folks in Hollywood to imagine these comics as movies cast with real actors. Mm. So that whole mindset of producing a comic a certain way with a lot of talking heads and storytelling and realistic style is with Hollywood in mind. So it's very easy for them to put out stuff, but they are limited within their range of superhero type stuff because that seems to be the way the movies go. Mm-hmm. DC, thanks to Vertigo, has managed to put Lucifer and Preacher and things like that onto TV. Mm-hmm. But if you leave it to the smaller companies are limited with what deals they can make. So fortunately, The Walking Dead did well for Robert Kirkman, so he's able to put other stuff up there. IDW has had some success with their movies in a Hellboy or whatever, and they managed to get other things produced. But there's a lot of publishers that want to do things that just can't get enough circulation just from the comic to make enough money. Which is a plea for to all the listeners out there: go out and buy some comics, for heaven's sake. If you can get to a comic shop, it'll help the business overall. Mm-hmm. But if you can't find them, then you go to Powfolio. And another thing worth mentioning there: mm-hmm. if you're reading on Powfolio and you really like the mm-hmm. comic and wish you had a printed copy of the comic or the graphic novel or whatever, in many cases, if the publisher has a graphic novel available, then they've included a link on Powfolio that you can click at the end of reading the comic, and it'll take you directly to Amazon, where you can order the comic or the graphic novel from Amazon, and, of course, the publisher makes some money from that.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up because, it's kind of like music a lot of times. If you hear something you like, or if you read something you like, to go out and support it, or even like if you see an artist you like or a writer you like and you'd want to seek out their other projects.
Oh yes, and so we're trying to do everything that we can. We being Regina Entertainment's the company behind Powfolio. Glowdot was the amazing designer of the app. So we're we're really happy to do this in a way that makes comics available to everyone, not only with the free comics, but the being able to buy them from Amazon with a click of a button. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to do as much as we can to expand the comic market to be more like it used to be when I was growing up as a kid.
Mm-hmm. Not to ask, is there a difference between, because you have comics here and there's also graphic novels, is there an actual difference between a comic book and a graphic novel, besides the graphic novel just being a collection of comics?
Well, sometimes there are. I mean, some books have been deliberately written as the long-form comic book of, 60, 80, 100, 200 pages, whatever. And the publishers have elected not to release them as serialized comics first. In cases like that, both on Powfolio and in the stores or on Amazon, those books have only been available in the square-bound format. Mm-hmm. But graphic novels have also been universally expanded to be a term for all collected editions as well. So if Marvel or DC or Giant or any of these other publishers releases a mini-series, mm-hmm. and it's one story that's then collected, they say, okay, the graphic novel version is out now, and that just means it's a thick comic book.
Exactly, yeah. By the way, as I mentioned, Sin City was another movie I thought did a great job. It's almost like watching the panels of the comic book on screen.
Oh yeah, it's very cool.
Mm-hmm. Very stylized, which is cool. Now, someone would out there, if either they did like an independent comic or they were a publisher and they wanted to approach you guys about maybe having some of their stuff on Powfolio, how would they go about that?
Well, sure. Any creator or somebody who's done a great comic that they've kickstarted, or any publishers that aren't on Powfolio yet, can all reach out to us. It's just email us at info@powfolio.com. And we're happy to take a look at independent projects. We are trying to do professional level stuff on here, but we found a lot of independent creators have only one title in them, and they're doing a great job with it. And we've put a number of those on to Powfolio.
Yeah.
And we've also found that there were publishers who didn't know about it. But I do interviews like this. It's like, hey, I just found out about Powfolio. I downloaded it. It's great. I want to be on there. And we're happy to sign them up.
Yeah, that's very cool. I mean, we have a couple of regular guests on the show who are comic book artists and writers, and I'm definitely going to tell them about it.
Oh, that's phenomenal. And, the more people, the more products we can get on there for everybody to read. That's a win-win for everybody. If somebody has completed comics that they want to put up there, that's good stuff that we want everybody to see. Love it. Get it up there. They make some money. The Powfolio makes some money, and the fans all benefit because they're getting more great comics to read.
Mm-hmm. So, if you had to choose a comic that you wrote yourself that you're most proud of, or a few that you're most proud of, what would be something you'd want people to seek out and check out?
Oh, if they're popping on the Powfolio, I mentioned the Exposure comic book on there. I've got 14 issues of that up there. The first half of the run was done by artist Al Rio, the late great Al Rio, that worked on it originally when we did the comic at Image in the late 90s. And the more current issues are drawn by Jinky Coronado, and they're new stories, and they're pretty wonderful. Jinky is also the writer and artist of a project called Bonsai Girl, which is her adventures of a Filipino schoolgirl fighting Asian monsters of myth. Well, so it's a lot of fun. It has a lot of the trappings of manga or anime, but a distinct slant coming from the Filipino. And so it has a lot of what she grew up with, rather than what you might see out of Hong Kong or China or Japan or whatever. So Filipino monsters and myths. You don't see that in most comics these days. Mm-hmm. There's also a wonderful comic up there called Marry Me, which I think is the very idea of it tickles me. Imagine a pop star up there. You've read about pop stars having meltdowns, Britney Spears and so forth. Imagine a pop star like that that's going through that life, and she's looking out in the audience at the end of one of her concerts, and there's a cute boy holding up a sign saying, "Marry me." She just says, "I'm just so sick of this life." So she yells out to him, "Okay, I will." And she does. So so you get to read about the life of that girl. So that's what's wonderful about something like this, that with a choice of so many different comics, so many different subjects, we're not just limited to superheroes. We have all these other genres, all these other ways of telling stories in this medium.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very cool. I honestly do have it on my phone, and I've been checking out a lot of the different titles here, and a lot of them I want to read, both the Golden Age and some of the newer horror stuff. I'm going to have a good time here. So, Powfolio, and you can get that on, like I said, any type of mobile device. You can even go to powfolio.com, and it'll show you how to download them. It's very easy.
Yes.
And I want to thank you for coming on. It's been a lot of fun talking to you.
All right, thank you so much.
This is Marty Langford, director of Doomed, the untold story of Roger Corman's The Fantastic Four, and you're listening to Without Your Head.